Stephen Wayans stepped through the glass doors of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, the steady hum of travelers creating a constant buzz around him. He walked with a sense of purpose, his polished shoes clicking softly on the tile floor. His tailored navy suit and crisp white shirt stood out amid the sea of casual attire, a subtle display of quiet authority. A sleek, black carry-on bag swung effortlessly from his shoulder, a symbol of years spent navigating the world of business travel. As he neared security, Stephen scanned the lines with the precision of someone accustomed to these routines, selecting the one that moved with efficiency. The TSA agents offered their standard instructions, their voices neutral and professional. He handed over his ID and boarding pass, meeting their gaze with a steady confidence. "Thank you," he said, his baritone voice calm as he retrieved his belongings and moved forward toward the terminal. Stephen was no stranger to airports. His work had taken him across the country and beyond, yet he seldom viewed these spaces as anything more than transitional. Today, however, there was a slight tinge of excitement in the air. The meeting waiting for him in Los Angeles was crucial, though not merely business. It held personal significance as well. At Gate B14, boarding had already begun. The gate agent scanned his pass, her voice professional yet brisk. "Enjoy your flight, Mr. Wayans," she said with a practiced smile. Stephen nodded politely, his face serene, before stepping onto the jet bridge, where the cool air-conditioned breeze greeted him. Inside the plane, the first-class cabin gleamed, its soft leather seats and perfectly folded blankets exuding an air of comfort and luxury. He found his seat 3A, stowing his carry-on bag above, before settling into the spacious seat. With calm efficiency, Stephen pulled out his tablet, reviewing emails with the kind of focused determination that came naturally to him. Around him, the other passengers filed in, a young couple occupying 1A and 1B, a businessman in 2D, and a few others filling the section. Stephen could feel the occasional glance directed his way, subtle but familiar. Over the years, he'd grown accustomed to such attention. In spaces like this, where he wasn't expected to belong, scrutiny was inevitable. He had learned to move through it with ease. The cabin crew began their rounds, their crisp uniforms and efficient movements a reminder of the professionalism that accompanied first-class travel. It was then that Amanda Harris entered the cabin. She moved with purpose, her eyes scanning the rows with sharp precision. In her mid-30s, she carried herself like someone who believed she was in charge, even if her title didn't quite reflect that power. She adjusted her scarf as her gaze drifted down the aisle, briefly meeting Stephen's before quickly shifting away. Stephen, unfazed, returned his attention to his tablet, typing out a response to an email from his assistant. What he didn't notice was Amanda pausing a few rows ahead, her expression tightening as she glanced back toward him. The door to the plane closed, the engines humming softly in the background as the calm voice over the intercom began the safety instructions. But Stephen's focus remained fixed on his meeting itinerary. Routine, just another flight, or so he thought. He was lost in his work, the gentle hum of passengers settling and providing the softest of backdrops. And then he heard it, the unmistakable sound of heels clicking purposefully against the cabin floor. He glanced up briefly, just in time to see Amanda approaching his seat. Her posture was rigid, and the forced politeness in her expression barely concealed something sharper beneath the surface. "Excuse me, sir," Amanda said, her voice clipped but measured. "Can I see your boarding pass, please?" Stephen blinked, caught off guard but unbothered. "Of course," he replied, his tone calm as he reached into the breast pocket of his blazer and handed her the boarding pass. Amanda took it with a swift, almost dismissive motion, her eyes narrowing slightly as she read the details. "This is for first class," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "That's correct," Stephen replied, his demeanor as steady as ever, his voice offering no hint of impatience. Amanda hesitated, her expression faltering for just a moment. It wasn't the details on the ticket that seemed to trouble her, but Stephen himself. "I'll be right back," she muttered, her voice slightly strained as she clutched the boarding pass and walked briskly toward the galley at the front of the cabin. Stephen sat back, puzzled but not particularly alarmed. He wasn't new to these situations. Life had given him plenty of experience with moments like this. He glanced across the aisle at the businessman seated opposite him, who offered a brief, uncomfortable smile before returning to his phone. A few moments later, Amanda returned, her face set, the earlier mask of politeness now replaced with a more direct expression. "Mr. Wayans," she began, her voice louder this time, drawing the attention of several passengers. "I need to speak with you privately. Would you mind coming with me?" Stephen raised an eyebrow, confusion flickering in his eyes. "Is there an issue with my seat?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with quiet curiosity. "I need to verify some details about your ticket," Amanda replied, avoiding the question entirely. She gestured toward the galley, where the narrow space promised a semblance of privacy. With a soft exhale, Stephen stood, straightening his jacket before picking up his tablet. "Lead the way," he said, his tone calm but firm. As he followed Amanda, he could feel the weight of curious stares from the other passengers. Whispers rippled through the first-class cabin, faint but unmistakable. Amanda stopped just outside the galley, her arms crossed tightly as she turned to face him. "It seems there's been a mistake with your booking," she said, her words clipped. "This seat may not be appropriate for you." Stephen's expression remained unchanged, but his voice carried a quiet edge. "In what way exactly is it not appropriate?" Amanda faltered for the first time. "I've already checked. I'll need you to move to a seat in the main cabin." A silence stretched between them, heavy with implications. Stephen's response was measured, his voice calm but firm. "My ticket was booked weeks ago, and it was confirmed. If there's been a mistake, perhaps you should double-check." Amanda's discomfort bubbled into frustration. "I don't have time for this, sir. Either you move, or I'll have to call security." Stephen stood still for a moment, his face unreadable. Then with a brief nod he replied, "Fine." He turned back toward his seat, and began gathering his belongings, his movements deliberate. The walk to the economy section felt longer than it should have. Stephen kept his head high, despite the whispers that followed him down the aisle, some sympathetic, others indifferent. Amanda escorted him to a cramped middle seat near the back of the plane. "Here you go," she said curtly, as though offering him a consolation prize. Stephen sat down without a word, carefully placing his carry-on under the seat in front of him. Amanda walked away, her heels clicking once again, but this time, with less confidence. Stephen took a deep breath, his composure unshaken. He pulled out his phone, his fingers moving swiftly as he typed a message. When he hit send, a faint, knowing smile tugged at the corners of his lips. In the cramped economy section, the discomfort of the space wasn't the issue. It was the principle. He leaned back slightly, pulling his phone from his pocket, and reviewing the response he'd just received. The reply was swift and direct. "Understood." Monitoring the situation, he glanced up, catching the faint concern in the eyes of Deborah, the young flight attendant assigned to the economy section. Her gaze lingered for a moment before she approached him cautiously. "Sir, is everything okay?" she asked softly, her tone genuinely concerned. Stephen offered a small, polite smile. "I'm fine, thank you. Just a little misunderstanding." Deborah hesitated, her gaze flicking toward the front of the cabin where Amanda had disappeared. "If there's anything I can do, please don't hesitate to let me know." "Thank you, Deborah," Stephen said, his voice calm and reassuring as she walked away. He returned to his phone, fingers moving quickly as he sent another message. "Proceed as planned. Notify the executive team immediately." Meanwhile, in the first-class galley, Amanda Harris stood with her arms crossed, speaking in hushed tones to another flight attendant. "I don't know what his deal is," she said, her frustration seeping through. Something about him didn't sit right." The other flight attendant, a middle-aged man named Dennis, raised an eyebrow. "You mean something about him didn't sit right?" he replied, his tone sharp. Amanda bristled but said nothing, her focus now on pouring a drink for a passenger. The tension in her movements was palpable. Back in economy, Stephen opened his tablet, typing out a detailed account of the incident. To anyone watching, it looked as if he were drafting an email. In truth, he was meticulously documenting everything, including timestamps. Years of experience had taught him the value of documentation, and he wasn't about to let this moment slip by unrecorded. The plane cruised smoothly at 35,000 feet, the cabin lights dimming slightly as passengers settled in. Deborah returned to Stephen's seat, offering him a cup of water and a small napkin. "Just in case you need anything," she said softly, placing it on his tray table. Stephen thanked her again, appreciating the gesture, though his mind was elsewhere. A vibration from his phone drew his attention, a response to his earlier message confirming that the executive team was aware and taking immediate action. Stephen leaned back, folding his arms across his chest. Amanda's actions had gone beyond an isolated incident. They were symptomatic of a larger issue. Stephen was determined to address it head-on. Up front, Amanda's day was about to take a sharp turn. As she walked down the aisle, Dennis intercepted her, a cordless phone in hand. "It's for you," he said, his expression unreadable. "For me?" Amanda asked, confused. Dennis nodded. "They're asking for you by name." Amanda hesitated but took the phone. "This is Amanda Harris," she said briskly. The voice on the other end was calm but firm. "This is the airline's executive office. We've received a formal complaint regarding a first-class passenger. We need your immediate cooperation." Amanda's face drained of color. A complaint about me?" "Yes, Miss Harris. We'll need a full account of the incident upon landing. For now, ensure all passengers are treated respectfully." The line went dead, leaving Amanda holding the phone in stunned silence. The words echoed in her mind like a dull hum, each one a weight that grew heavier with every passing second. Her usual confidence seemed to dissolve in the quiet aftermath. It was the first time that day she felt the full force of her decisions pressing down on her, as though the gravity of everything she'd set in motion was finally catching up with her. Amanda Harris, hands trembling, handed the phone back to Dennis. Her bravado had disappeared, replaced by a gnawing unease. She forced her eyes to look away, glancing toward the economy cabin. Her gaze sought him out instinctively, Stephen Wayans. There he sat, an island of calm in the middle of the turbulent plane, his posture impeccable, his face unreadable. There was no sign of the disruption she'd been dreading. He remained perfectly still, and yet Amanda could feel her stomach twist with a sense of foreboding. The silence was broken by Dennis's voice, sharp and pragmatic. "You should probably start thinking about what you're going to say. They don't call mid-flight unless it's serious." Amanda shot him a glare, but her usual bite was missing from her response. "I don't need your advice, Dennis," she muttered, brushing past him toward the galley. But as she tried to return to her duties, a tremor in her hands betrayed her nerves. She watched helpless, as a spill of coffee sloshed onto a tray. Hastily, she grabbed a napkin, wiping it away, though it did little to steady her heart. Back in economy, Stephen remained a picture of composure. Occasionally, his fingers tapped away on his tablet, but his eyes would flicker toward the front, always watching, always assessing. He said nothing, did nothing to draw attention to himself. His gaze was quiet, but it wasn't lost on her. He saw everything. Around him, the passengers had long since returned to their books or their movies. They were lost in their own worlds, until one voice cut through the monotony. Deborah, the flight attendant, still hovered near his row, concern in her eyes. "Sir," she said softly, leaning down to him. "Is everything truly okay? You don't have to say, but you don't seem fine." Stephen met her eyes, his calm gaze steady. "Deborah, I'll be fine," he assured her, his voice smooth and reassuring. "But your kindness doesn't go unnoticed." She gave a small, uncertain smile and stepped back, leaving him to resume his quiet work. A few more taps, and another message was sent. "Prepare for immediate action upon landing. Ensure all protocols are followed." As the flight continued, Amanda couldn't shake the growing sense of dread that crept over her each time she glanced toward economy. Each time their eyes met, Stephen's calmness unsettled her more. Was he waiting for something? Did he know something she didn't? Dennis, sensing her unease, now kept his distance, busied himself elsewhere, leaving her to stew in her own isolation. The weight of the earlier phone call hung over her like a storm cloud, threatening to break at any moment. Desperate for clarity, she made her way toward the cockpit, knocking lightly before entering. Inside, Captain Andrews was reviewing flight data, his face unreadable. Amanda's voice faltered as she spoke, the words feeling like a heavy stone in her throat. "Captain Andrews, have you received any updates from the airline?" The captain looked up, his expression sharp, a quiet authority in his gaze. Miss Harris, I've been informed of a situation involving a first-class passenger. Is there something I should know? Amanda's heart skipped a beat, the realization striking her cold. It's a misunderstanding, she said quickly, the words tumbling out in a rush. There may have been a mix-up with the ticket. Captain Andrews raised a hand, cutting her off. Save it for the report, Miss Harris. Your instructions are clear. Ensure every passenger is treated with respect. Do not escalate this further. Amanda nodded stiffly and retreated, her heart pounding as she walked back through the cabin. Every step seemed to grow heavier, and every glance sharper. By the time she reached the galley again, she knew deep down that this wasn't going to end well. In economy, Stephen glanced at his watch, his movements deliberate as the minutes ticked down. He tapped out one final message, ready for landing. All arrangements confirmed. The response came swiftly, confirmed. Security team will be on site. Action will be swift and professional. Stephen slipped his phone into his pocket and folded his hands in his lap, the turbulence outside doing nothing to ruffle his composure. This was bigger than his personal discomfort. It was about accountability, about ensuring that actions that had long gone unchecked would finally be brought to light. As the plane began its descent, Amanda made one last trip down the aisle. Her eyes found Stephen again. This time, their gazes locked, and for a moment, she saw no malice in his eyes, only a quiet confidence that sent a chill through her. It was as if he already knew how this would play out. It was a terrifying thought. The captain's voice broke through the tension in the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing shortly. Please remain seated and ensure your belongings are stowed. As the seatbelt signs flashed, passengers straightened, securing themselves, their bodies braced for the final moments of the flight. Stephen leaned back slightly in his seat, calmness radiating from him like a shield. He had no doubt the next steps had already been set in motion. It wasn't just a matter of landing. It was about what came after. When the plane touched down at Los Angeles International Airport, the faint jolt of the landing gear hitting the runway broke the silence. Passengers stirred, unbuckling their seat belts and gathering their belongings. For most, it was the end of another flight. For Amanda Harris, it marked the beginning of a reckoning. Stephen Wayans remained seated, his back straight, as the passengers around him shuffled into the aisle. He wasn't in a rush. His gaze flickered briefly to his phone. One last time. The confirmation blinked on the screen. Security team in position. Proceed as planned. At the front of the plane, Amanda stood stiffly, her usual polished demeanor slipping away with every passing moment. Her smile was forced, fleeting. It faded entirely when two uniformed security officers boarded the plane. They scanned the cabin briefly, before their eyes fixed on her. "Are you Amanda Harris?" one of them asked, his tone professional but firm. Amanda's breath caught in her throat. "Yes," she stammered, her gaze flicking nervously toward the galley. "We need to speak with you regarding an incident that occurred during this flight," the officer continued. His voice was calm, yet commanding. "Please come with us." A ripple of murmurs spread through the cabin, passengers watching as Amanda hesitated, her face flushed with the realization that there was no escape. Slowly, her trembling hands removed her scarf, draping it over her arm, and she nodded, wordlessly following the officers down the aisle. Stephen stood up then, his movements deliberate. He gathered his belongings carefully, stepping into the aisle with unhurried grace. Deborah, the kind flight attendant from earlier, approached him once more. Her voice was hesitant. "Mr. Wayans," she began softly, "I just want to say I'm sorry for what happened back there. I don't know the details, but it wasn't right." Stephen met her gaze, his expression warm but serious. "Thank you, Deborah. I noticed your kindness during the flight, and I'll make sure others do too." Deborah blinked, taken aback by his words, her smile small and uncertain. "Thank you," she whispered, stepping aside to allow him to continue toward the exit. As Stephen disembarked, the terminal buzzed with the usual chaos. Overhead announcements, harried travelers, the steady rhythm of rolling luggage. Near the gate, a tall man in a dark suit waited. He greeted Stephen with a firm handshake. "Mr. Wayans," the man said respectfully, "everything has been addressed. Miss Harris is being debriefed, And the executive team is ready for your report. Stephen nodded, his expression unflinching. Good. Let's ensure this isn't treated as an isolated incident. Systemic changes are overdue. The man gave a slight smile. Understood. In a sterile conference room just beyond the gate, Amanda sat across from two security officers and an airline representative. Her palms were damp, and her voice wavered as she tried to explain herself. I didn't mean to, she said, her words faltering. I thought there was a mistake with his ticket. The airline representative, a woman with a clipboard and a no-nonsense demeanor, interrupted her. Miss Harris, the passenger in question, Mr. Wayans, is not only a valued customer, but a senior executive with this airline. Your actions have not only caused him personal discomfort, but have exposed the company to significant liability. Amanda's eyes widened. He's what? The officer continued, his tone unyielding. Your actions appear to have been based on assumptions, not facts. This incident will be escalated to the airline's disciplinary committee, effective immediately. You are suspended pending further review. Amanda's face drained of color as the reality of the situation settled in. Her carefully built career now hung by a thread. I didn't know, she whispered, but the words felt hollow even to her. As Amanda faced the consequences, Stephen was already preparing for the next steps. He met with a small team of executives in a private lounge. His voice, measured and resolute, filled the room. This isn't just about what happened to me, he said. It's about what this represents. Incidents like this don't happen in isolation. They're a reflection of deeper issues within our culture. One of the executives nodded, taking notes. We'll ensure a thorough investigation and implement changes immediately. Start with mandatory sensitivity and bias training, Stephen suggested, and recognize employees like Deborah, who demonstrated professionalism and empathy in a difficult situation. The team agreed, shifting the conversation toward logistics and timelines. For Stephen, this wasn't just a personal affront. It was an opportunity to spark meaningful progress. Stephen Wayans exited the private lounge, his steps deliberate. The team he left behind was already drafting action plans, but his mind remained focused on the task ahead. His position as a senior executive wasn't something he flaunted, but today, it was a tool for change. As Stephen approached the baggage claim, the weight of the moment settled in. He had navigated a system that had failed its own standards, and now, with his stance, he sought not recognition but real lasting change. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a message from the airline's CEO reading, "Thank you for handling this with grace. Your input is invaluable. We'll ensure lasting change." Stephen stared at the message for a moment, the words lingering in his mind. Before he could dwell too long, he tucked the phone into his pocket. For him, this wasn't about basking in the glow of gratitude. No, it was far more personal. This was about ensuring that no one else had to endure the treatment he had. Meanwhile, across town, Amanda Harris sat alone in her small, dimly lit apartment. Her eyes were fixated on her termination email. It felt as though the air had thickened, pressing down on her chest as she read the final words again. Your behavior during Flight 87 directly contradicts the company's values. Your employment is hereby terminated. She put the phone down, her mind drowning in a whirlpool of regret. The weight of her actions, those moments of judgment, felt suffocating. She scrolled through a string of messages from friends and colleagues. Some were filled with disbelief, others with hollow sympathy. But Amanda knew the truth all too well. She had made a mistake, a catastrophic one, that had cost her everything. Her thoughts kept circling back to Stephen. She had treated him as if he didn't belong, as if he were beneath her. And in doing so, she had not only jeopardized her career, but lost something far more precious, her integrity. With shaking hands, she opened her email once more. She knew she owed him an apology, a real one. Her fingers hovered over the keys. I owe you an apology, she began, but the words didn't feel right. She stopped, frustrated, unable to express what she felt. The cursor blinked in mockery of her hesitation. Instead of finishing the email, she closed the laptop, sinking deeper into the chair. The weight of what she had done pressed down on her. Irreversible, unfixable. Days later, a memo circulated within the airline. Changes were coming. Among the announcements was a promotion for Deborah, now a senior flight attendant, along with a personal commendation from Stephen Wayans. Deborah stood in the airport lounge, her eyes widening in disbelief as she read the words on her phone. In challenging moments, true professionalism shines. Deborah's compassion and integrity are exemplary. Her colleagues gathered around, offering congratulations, but Deborah's mind wandered elsewhere. Stephen's words stayed with her, reminding her of something she had done without thinking twice. She had simply treated a person with the respect they deserved, but it had meant so much more. Weeks passed, and Stephen found himself standing before a group of airline employees at the company's headquarters in Dallas. The room was buzzing with energy as staff and executives gathered for their first mandatory sensitivity training session. Stephen was the keynote speaker. He stood tall at the podium, looking over the room, his voice steady. "What happened to me could have happened to anyone. And that's the problem," he said, pausing for emphasis. His words hung in the air, thick with truth. Today isn't about assigning blame. It's about recognizing the biases we all carry and committing to do better. For ourselves, for our colleagues, for our passengers. The room was silent. His words struck deep. For Stephen, this wasn't just a speech. It was the spark of something bigger. A cultural shift he hoped would ripple through the entire airline industry and beyond. As evening fell, Stephen left the headquarters. The sky was painted with hues of orange and pink, the fading sunlight casting a warm glow over the city. He thought about that flight, Amanda's actions, Deborah's kindness, the transformation already taking shape. It had started with a single moment, but for Stephen, that moment symbolized something much larger. The power of resilience, the necessity of accountability, and the potential for progress when dignity is upheld. Months later, the impact of Flight 87 began to spread. The airline made headlines for its swift response, unveiling new policies and training programs aimed at addressing bias and improving the customer experience. While the public hailed the company's efforts, insiders knew the real catalyst for change had been Stephen Wayans. For Amanda, however, life had become a downward spiral. News of her dismissal spread like wildfire, and finding work in the same industry was nearly impossible. Her reputation lay in tatters, and every day the weight of regret grew heavier. She often thought back to Stephen, the way he had remained composed when faced with her actions, how his quiet strength had set the wheels of change in motion. One day she decided to reach out. She sent him an email, pouring out an apology that was long overdue. "I failed you," she wrote. "But more importantly, I failed myself and the values I thought I stood for. I am deeply sorry for the harm I caused." Stephen read her email the next morning. He took his time, carefully absorbing every word. But he didn't respond immediately. For him, this wasn't about Amanda anymore. It was about the far-reaching effects her behavior had triggered. Systemic changes that were already rippling through airports nationwide. The mandatory sensitivity training sessions were in full swing, and employees were beginning to recognize their own biases and the impact they had on others. Deborah was a key figure in the training, sharing her experiences as someone who had witnessed both the worst and the best in her colleagues. Her promotion had brought her into leadership circles, where she continued to advocate for inclusivity and fairness. One afternoon, she received a call from Stephen. "I wanted to thank you personally," he said warmly. "You've been an integral part of this process." Deborah hesitated before replying, her voice soft. "I should be thanking you, Mr. Wayans. You didn't just stand up for yourself. You stood up for all of us." Stephen chuckled. "It's Stephen, Deborah. And this was never just about me." Amanda, no longer working in aviation, turned her energy towards volunteering and mentoring. She threw herself into community work, hoping to make amends, to atone for her past. The shadow of her actions on Flight 87 never fully left her, but she used it as fuel to drive her forward, becoming a better person. One evening, at a community workshop, Amanda overheard a discussion about the airline's new initiatives. Hearing the impact those changes had made filled her with a strange mix of pride and regret. The company had accomplished something great, but it was at her expense. Stephen, meanwhile, continued his work, championing progress both within the airline and beyond. He became a sought-after speaker at industry conferences, sharing his story not to dwell on the past, but to inspire others to build a better future. His message was simple but powerful. True change begins with accountability and the courage to face uncomfortable truths. Months later, on a late afternoon flight, Stephen once again found himself in first class. As the plane leveled out, Deborah approached his seat, a warm smile on her face. "Good afternoon, Mr. Wayans," she greeted him. "Anything I can get for you?" Stephen looked up, his expression soft. "Just keep doing what you're doing, Deborah." As she walked away, he gazed out the window. The horizon stretched out before him, the sky vast and endless. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of closure. His journey had no definitive end, but he knew this much. The most meaningful journeys weren't about where you started or where you ended up. They were about the impact you made along the way. The legacy of Flight 87 had far outlived that single moment. The airline's transformation became a model for other industries, proving that bias could be addressed and empathy could reshape corporate culture. Deborah thrived in her new role, her compassion earning her respect from peers and passengers alike. She took every opportunity to lead by example, encouraging her colleagues to share stories of exceptional service. Deborah found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her here, the influence of Stephen's advocacy, and how it had elevated not just her career, but the culture of the entire airline. She resolved to pay that gift forward with every interaction she had. Amanda, no longer a part of the aviation world, slowly rebuilt her life. She found new purpose in community work, determined to learn from her past and make a difference. Years later, she attended an industry conference on equity and inclusion. Stephen Wayans was the keynote speaker, and from the back of the room, Amanda listened intently. His words resonated deeply. "I've learned that progress isn't a straight line," he said. "We all make mistakes. What matters is how we learn from them, and what we do to make sure those mistakes aren't repeated." Amanda left the conference feeling a renewed sense of determination. She couldn't change the past, but she could continue striving to be better and inspire others to do the same. For Stephen, Flight 87 was never about personal vindication. It was a catalyst, a moment that exposed a much larger issue. His work wasn't just about policy updates. It was about creating a culture where respect wasn't an afterthought. It was foundational. On the anniversary of that fateful flight, Stephen received a letter from Deborah. She shared a story about a recent flight where a new hire had diffused a tense situation with empathy and grace, thanks to the airline's new training programs. "This is the future you helped create," Deborah wrote. Stephen folded the letter, tucking it away in his desk drawer. He leaned back in his chair, gazing out the window at the busy tarmac below. Planes were taking off and landing, each carrying passengers with their own stories, their own challenges. Stephen's journey was far from over. But as he looked back at the events of the past year, he felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. He had turned a moment of prejudice into an opportunity for growth, not just for himself, but for everyone involved. The sky stretched before him, vast and endless, a symbol of boundless potential. And as he prepared for his next meeting, Stephen thought, perhaps not for the first time, that the most meaningful journeys were never about where you started or where you ended up. They were about the impact you made along the way.